So Nick left me with a difficult mission. In 10 minutes, I'm to do an overview of the history of New York City's public markets, and so this might be a surprising slide to start with. But if I'm starting with the beginning of the 20th century, and I'm willing later to answer questions about a little bit earlier than that, although it's not really the period I focused on. So if we look at 1901, and we look at average food spending in New York City, it was 43.7 cents on the dollar of average household income. That number remains pretty consistent until about 1934, where that drops to a little bit over a third of the average household income. And finally, in 1960 is the first year when housing becomes a greater share of household expense. The reason why I'm mentioning this is part of the reason, among sort of 2 or 3 major factors, why around 1900 there begins to be a lot of talk in New York City about problems with our public food sector and what that might mean. At the time, New York City did have public markets. The public market system was disaggregated, it was chaotic, and it was managed by a series of different agencies. And so there was concern that the number of middlemen involved in an ordinary transaction and the amount of corruption in the system were driving up the cost of food. Let's see, I always forget how to do this. Wow, okay, great. Another point of contention, and this sort of starts emerging from both civic leaders and also among the middle classes who were very aware of New York City's role in the world. I use this map, although it doesn't come out so clearly, just to kind of indicate that at the time it was considered a badge of honor that New York City was this huge port, this very important center where food was arriving, and so that only 12% of the food eaten in New York City in the 1920s was actually produced in New York State. So New York City is this major point of distribution, and the city has never invested in a modern sanitary food system. So people have traveled to places like Paris, to Berlin, to Budapest, to cities in Asia, to cities in South America, cities across the United States like Fort Wayne, in addition to places like Boston and New Orleans where we know that there are good public market systems. Coming back to New York City, and there are a lot of public forums around this issue, civic leaders, including, for example, Bronx Borough President, start proposing ideas about what would a public market system look like for New York City, what would be its goals. And a lot of the debates are rather interesting. Should the city be the sole purveyor? Should the city be only investing in wholesale markets? What would be the linkages across, along the river, for example? Or should the city actually get involved in retail trade? Real estate interests and others, sort of the emerging progressives, are also concerned about the fact that in addition to other forms of retailing, push carts are growing in vast numbers. And these are images that are familiar to everybody because I think this ends up being sort of the dominant narrative about why New York City cleaned up its food system in the first half of the 20th century. But just to point out, as these push carts are growing in numbers and they become a very important form of living, a way for people to earn a living, they coexisted very happily with other forms of retailing. There had been chain grocery stores that had been emerging since the 1870s. There were plenty of fixed stores that coexisted with push carts. And at the time, it was well recognized that the rents along streets that had thriving push cart markets were in fact higher than the rents along streets that did not have pushcart markets because the push carts drew customers. Customers didn't buy the same goods usually from the push carts as they did from the stores. And these are just some more of these very, I think, familiar street scenes. That said, real estate interests, as I said, and also some of the progressives started being concerned about the condition of the pushcart markets and the fact that there was meat and fish and a lot of goods being sold on the street. The markets were not particularly sanitary. There were no trash cans. People did burn their trash. These markets were open long into the night, but this was also a time in New York City where the entire city was rather crowded. Okay, so around the 1920s, and just to back up for a minute, like I said, I'm speeding through this. 1917, World War I, there's the creation of the Federal Food Board, and simultaneously there's finally the creation of the New York Department of Markets as a way of consolidating control over New York City's various forms of public markets. New York City's first commissioner of markets, Henry Moskowitz, is also appointed the New York Federal Food Board director. This is sort of, I'm going to really skim over this very quickly. So this is sort of the first moment where there's this consolidation. The federal food board's primary occupation was with making sure that people weren't hoarding and that there wasn't price gouging. Policies were implemented unevenly. There was a lot of recognition afterwards. Yes, 5 minutes, great, I will speed. Okay, so the Department of Public Markets starts trying to figure out what its mandate is. Among the things it starts doing is licensing and permitting push carts. They also start mapping where the push carts are located. So here, for example, there's sort of a concentration of push cart markets down in this area here, Lower East Side, and then you get some concentrations up in here as well, a little bit lighter. But these are areas that are generally recognized to be immigrant neighborhoods, not surprisingly. During World War I, and I'm just going to skip this one. So flash forward to 1934, Mayor LaGuardia comes into office, very aware that with the high cost of living, that the threat to civic order is imminent, and appoints Commissioner William Morgan, who views that food is actually a really essential element in terms of not only public health, but public well-being. Mayor LaGuardia's, I think, most lasting legacy in many ways, and what I think people like to summarize his food policies as, is his efforts to enclose the push carts in enclosed markets. There are a number of discussions around this. I think there's a lot of familiar criticism around what he did. A lot of the merchants who found their way into the markets also found that the conditions were in fact improved to some degree. There was heat, there was running water, there was storage. I think it's a mixed legacy, to say the least. And these are just some pictures of the markets as they were opening. Part of the legacy of LaGuardia's administration, which I think is under-recognized, is the role of education and information that the Department of Markets promoted. Frances Foley Gannon was appointed a deputy commissioner, and her goal really was to deputize consumers. She did a lot of work, not only through her daily radio show, but through pamphlets, through classes that were organized at the markets. And these classes and the information really armed purchasers, armed consumers, which were, of course, always spoken about as women, as a powerful force that was set forth on New York City every morning. So her daily radio show not only included what was in season, but what was the wholesale price, how to prepare these foods. One of my favorite examples of Foley Gannon's impact was when she spoke a lot about the spread, the acceptable spread. What should a merchant be making in terms of profit? She reports in 1937 a 6-cent spread on the cost of eggs, 6 cents too high. Overnight, the prices of eggs across New York City goes down. And this is just a really quick example of some of the excerpts from her radio broadcasts. So this was really informative, nutritional information, how to prepare these foods, really urging women, as the consumers, of course, were always spoken of as women, to get out there and really demand high quality, but also to know what high quality was. And I think this is part of the LaGuardia, why is this jamming? Okay, anyway. So very, very quickly, I'm going to tie this up. By the 1950s, although Foley Gannon goes on with her radio show until 1962, there begins to be a lot more questioning around what the role of the department's market should be. And by the end of the 1950s, and certainly into the 60s, the department is finally disassembled in 1968. There's been a switch of thinking around the Department of Markets that all of these educational and informational services are superfluous, and in fact the Department of Markets should not only reduce the amount of property it holds, but also reduces its services merely to property management. I'm going to end really quickly. I'm going to take one more minute. Nick had asked me to sort of think about what were some of the positives or the takeaways or lessons that we can take from this period of time. I think, if anything, and we can definitely discuss the way these ideas were interpreted, but that first and foremost, I think what's important about some of these mid-20th century policies is the acknowledgement that food and food environments are really central to public health and to public well-being, and that includes civic order. I think the combination of information and education and the assumption that consumers were intelligent and invested is something that was also really important that came out of this period. A willingness to experiment, not so much under LaGuardia, but before LaGuardia, experimentations with free markets, include, experiments with promotions of fish consumption, the idea that a consumer could actually be turned into a force to change the shape of the market, really important. And I think the last thing to keep in mind as we look forward, and this de Blasio term, and you really did have us, Nick, because I think we're all waiting for de Blasio to articulate a food policy, is to, and I'm just going to leave these quotes up on the board for a second, is this idea of having a Department of Markets that is accountable and consolidates these policies around food, and as I said, accountability to the mayor, the public, and to the press. So that we're not disaggregated and that there is a point for the public to encounter the food policies of the city. So that's my really fast speed through this. Sorry, this was a little bit...